This particular presentation is all about root-lesion nematode or Pratylenchus thornei and the cost of getting it wrong. The approach we took was a pretty simple one, but it was a 2-year trial. In year 1, which is 2011, the grower created strips of high and low P. thornei populations simply by growing 2 different wheat varieties. In the 2nd year, we planted across those varieties and we had 3 key aims. Firstly, we wanted to look at the yield or the tolerance of a range of crops and varieties. Secondly, we wanted to test out this theory or hypothesis that when you had Pratylenchus thornei together with crown rot, you were probably exaggerating or exacerbating the crown rot impact. And thirdly, but certainly not least, we wanted to get some more data on the impact of these varieties on the populations you're going to face over the next year or 2, or their resistance. That's a photo of the site. Many of you will be aware we did similar work for the 2 years before out at Wimmera at Bill Yates's place, about 140 k's west, and under usually much tougher conditions. That particular graph shows you how effective we were at changing the Pratylenchus thornei population just by growing 2 different varieties of wheat in 12-metre strips side by side. These little blue columns, not surprisingly, are what we'll call the low P. thornei strips. That's where durum was the previous year. The yellow is where Sunvex was the previous year, and I'll call that the high P. thornei strips. Key point here is that overall we had about a 10-fold difference in nematode numbers just by changing the varieties in 2011. I'd stress that is at the upper range of what we'd normally see. It's much more common to see maybe a 5 to 7-fold difference in numbers. 10 is a pretty extreme one. Another point here, this red broken line is what Steve Simpfendorfer talked about before. That's our threshold level, the 2,000 thornei per kilogram of soil. But it is important to know it's a slightly unusual threshold in that at that sort of level you can expect up to a 20% yield loss in an intolerant wheat. So it's not a case of below that you're not going to have any effect on any wheats. It's certainly a cautioning point in terms of particularly yield loss in the intolerant ones. One of the issues that causes great grief, and I'm sure John Thompson would agree, is that there aren't telltale symptoms of Pratylenchus damage for most agronomists. There are perhaps if you've been working on the issue for 10 or 15 or more years, but we don't have anything like stripe rust or clear whiteheads to pick up in the paddock. I don't think this will come up all that well with this light, but that's the sort of crop growth we were seeing at the end of August where we grew Wylie, which is one of our most tolerant bred wheats, at that site. Green, lush, looks like a healthy wheat crop. Under the same conditions, that's what we were seeing with Strzelecki. Certainly measured much less biomass, we measured much less leaf area index, we had less tillers per metre, and what you can see quite often is this yellowing coming through, which you'd put down generally to nitrogen deficiency as well. In a paddock situation, quite often that's just put down as a poor thrift crop or an ill thrift crop. We didn't get the right rainfall, we didn't get a whole lot of other things. Whereas in fact, that particular site, that's what was coming through because of nematodes on that particular variety. Straight into yield. What I've done here is our main cereal trial and ranked the varieties from left to right in decreasing tolerance to P. thornei. The key thing here we were interested in was to look at the individual variety and what was the difference between the blue column and the yellow column. So the same variety, and as far as we can manage, the only difference is it was low to high nematodes. Now encouragingly, these little asterisks means there was a significant yield loss in that variety. And what you can see, it's all these varieties at the poor end of tolerance. So the tolerance ratings we get from John Thompson and his team are a very good and reliable indicator of what's going to happen under P. thornei pressure. In terms of magnitude, with something like Strzelecki, that was a 48% yield loss. We actually had Strzelecki in 3 different wheat trials at that location, and it averaged over 50% across the 3 sites. So it was very repeatable. However, that yield loss figure is very conservative. Now, firstly, if you hark back to those strips initially, we were comparing 20,000 to 2,000. We weren't comparing back to nil. With Strzelecki, it'd be quite expected that we could have already been losing 20% of yield in these blue strips. So that overall percentage impact is much higher than the 48%. Secondly, in those high nematode strips, those yellow ones, we actually started off with marginally more moisture, so we should have had less stress, and we believe we also started with marginally higher nitrogen. On top of that, and I'll cover it in a couple more moments, we also started with less crown rot in the high nematode strips. So everything actually favoured the yield in these high nematode strips, apart from, of course, having high nematodes. The other crop where the results are quite interesting from a yield perspective was when we looked at the chickpeas. And 5 different varieties here. You probably won't see it at the back, but the big concern here is we had a lot more variability in chickpea production at this particular site. The 3 cereal trials were fine in terms of variability, the canola trials were fine, the faba beans were fine, but we had inherently a lot more variability in the chickpea trials. We could throw the data out, or perhaps look at it to see if there are some interesting trends coming through. If we looked at the blue columns under low thornei pressure, we couldn't pick any difference between those varieties. They're all basically giving us the same sort of yield. However, what you can see in each case, we seem to be having this trend in terms of lower yield under higher P thornei pressure. We could analyse over all those varieties, and certainly it was significant at the 10% level that we had lower yield under the higher thornei pressure. Part of the reason for doing this work, John Thompson and his team, a number of years ago did some work in chickpeas where they were seeing up to a 20% yield loss. This perhaps would be supporting that, even though it's not as tight a trial as we'd like. When we did this work the year before with most of those varieties under lower nematode impact conditions, we had a 6% average yield loss in chickpeas. To me, what we're seeing is the warning bells. We're probably losing a lot more yield in chickpeas and some big dollars because of the widespread nature of thornei through our farming system. Other crops, with the canolas, we only had 4 varieties, 3 varieties of faba beans, no significant difference at that site. Same pattern occurred in 2011 out at Wimmera. If you wanted to put together a rough and ready comparison, the intolerant wheats in terms of yield loss is nearly off the scale. Drop back dramatically to what's happening or appears to be happening in chickpeas, and then much lower if there is any yield loss in our fabas and probably these brassicas. I mentioned earlier that we had crown rot through that site as well. It was chickpeas in 2010. In 2011, we had strips of Strzelecki, Belaroi or Sunvex. Steve Simpfendorfer tested the stubble at the end of the season. Not surprisingly, we had higher levels coming through from the durum and a moderate level of crown rot going into our trial. We've already tested the stubble after 2012, and we're up to about 90 or 95% of plants are infected with the crown rot fungus. So very widespread, very high levels. The durum country or the durum strips still had slightly higher levels, but it wasn't significantly different. So the low nematode strips started off with more crown rot in 2011. They ended up with slightly more crown rot in 2012. But when Steve and his team went through and looked at the stem browning and the height the stem browning went in the plant, which is what he'd termed the crown rot severity, we've got the complete reverse of that pattern. So with our 2 durum varieties and Strzelecki, so they're the 3 varieties which have the biggest impact from crown rot, we've actually got significantly higher expression of the disease even though we started off with less crown rot, we ended up with less crown rot, we're actually getting more symptoms in the plant. And this is what we're expecting from 3 or 4 years ago from our trials. We didn't have any scientific proof, but certainly it appears that if you've got crown rot under P. thornei pressure, just because the plant can't access as much moisture, you're going to be driving bigger crown rot effects as well. The other end of it that I get quite excited in is looking at the different varieties and what number of nematodes or levels of nematodes are being left behind. Again, this is a bit of a rough and ready comparison between the crops because they're all in separate trials. Got the different crops across the bottom and then the number in terms of thornei per kilogram of soil, and there's some pretty high numbers there. First thing, if you look at the yellow strips, they're the ones that we raised that population 12 or 15 months earlier by growing Sunvex. We've still got that coming through across every variety in every crop. So this is a long-term management issue, unfortunately. If you get a blowout in year 1, you might still be able to measure those impacts 1, 2, 3, 4 years later. So that's a key point. The other thing is when you look at the sort of numbers left behind by the canola, certainly much better than poor old faba beans. We got another set of data in on Friday which was nearly identical on the same varieties, and certainly canola much better than chickpeas. That backs up what we saw the previous year. The only thing I'd say, we were a little disappointed in what the canola did at that site. We're expecting to have less nematodes left behind than that. Talking to one of the Victorian pathologists, he saw the same thing 8 or 10 years ago. Canola's quite good, but it's probably more a moderately resistant crop rather than a fully resistant crop. The other ones here at this cereal end, I've pulled out the durums because consistently we see them leaving less nematodes behind. They've got crown rot issues, of course, but they seem to leave less P. thornei behind. And then finally the bread wheats. For those of you a bit older who know the old saying, oils ain't oils, to be honest, that's a pretty rubbery way of presenting the wheat results because wheats ain't wheat. That was a mean. That's the sort of pattern we see quite frequently coming through. We're getting very big differences between these varieties. Strzelecki and Sunvex were uniformly horrific in terms of the numbers they left behind. And then you've got a huge drop off to maybe varieties like Gregory, Spitfire, Wylie, Belleroy, and Caproy in this case being the best in terms of low numbers being left behind. When we started this trial the year before, we had a 10-fold difference between Belleroy and Sunvex. In that sort of situation, again, we had a 10-fold difference between the best and the worst wheat lines. Again, that's the higher end, but that's the sort of difference you can see. Variety selection really does have a huge part to play. Chickpeas, we haven't got as much data, haven't got as much confidence yet, but clearly at that site, Jimbor and Kyabra were leaving behind significantly more nematodes than Hattrick and Boundary and the new 912. I looked at the data we got from Wimmera the year before. With those same 4 varieties, it was exactly the same pattern of significant differences. So Hattrick and Boundary do have something better than some of those old ones, but if you compare them to the wheats, they're probably only like a Gregory. So they're still bad, but certainly not a Strzelecki or a Sunvex. So, big point, what were the actual costs? For these varieties, we had significant yield losses. We were looking at about a $200 per hectare loss in income going from low to high nematodes. So very big figures, and again, that's conservative. The other way of looking at it is to compare the performance back to our best variety, EGA Wylie. It's rated as our most tolerant commercial bread wheat to this nematode, and it's also probably our most tolerant bread wheat to crown rot. If the grower had chosen to grow Strzelecki rather than Wylie in that situation under high pressure, it would have been costing him over $500 per hectare last year. But that figure is made up of Pratylenchus thornei effect, It's also made up of a crown rot impact and other differences between those varieties. But a very big hit would have been on the pocket. Summary. Why is it so important? Pratylenchus thornei, and Steve Simpendorfer had one slide up that showed it. They're very widespread in our northern cropping system over the whole of the northern cropping region. What we're seeing, and certainly backs up the good work done by John Thompson and his team, they're impacting on yield. Haven't got time, they're impacting on grain quality in our poorer varieties. They're also increasing on nitrogen efficiency in much the same way as we're seeing with crown rot. All of those are happening in wheat, and I'm pretty concerned that we're probably losing maybe 5% or more even in our chickpeas. But on top of that, they're also increasing the severity of crown rot. So we've got something lurking there which is really cutting our income and profitability. Wheat variety selection, as you can see, is critical to minimise the yield and the economic impact. And that's what we saw so clearly at Yalleroy last year. But just as importantly, that crop and variety choice is critical in terms of that long-term management. And it will be a long-term management to keep these things at low numbers. And the key point here is, if nothing else, don't grow those sucker varieties. You're going to cause yourself years of grief. Conclusions. P. thornei is a very high priority wheat disease in this northern region, and I think probably has a bigger role even in terms of chickpeas. The impact we see, it seems to happen nearly every year in nearly every trial on our intolerant varieties. Whereas in contrast with something like crown rot, we can have huge yield losses, but it's very heavily driven by the season. So in 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, we had very low crown rot losses. In all those years, we were still getting Pratt thornei impacts on yield. So the thornei seems to be more consistent, but when we get a blowout with crown rot, it's going to be very bad. However, and it probably backs up Steve's comments, we need to focus on both of these diseases. To my mind, these are the two priority wheat diseases in the north. And finally, if nothing else, know before you sow, test your soil. There's a couple of tests that can be done. If you don't have P. thornei, consider yourself lucky, look after your hygiene, and you've got all the options to you under the sun. If you do have them, I'd suggest, regardless of the number, you've really got to start imposing P. thornei management, start changing your rotation choices, and pay much more attention to your variety choices as well. Reason being, if you don't do that, you can see the impacts are going to be very great in terms of the cost of thornei.
There's a slide there you had on the number of nematodes left behind by various crops. Yep. Do you have any info on cotton or sorghum on that?
We haven't got any back yet in terms of cotton. Cotton's generally regarded as a resistant crop. Sorghum's generally regarded as a resistant crop. We've got, I think, 6 or 8 trials worth of data back in the last 2 or 3 days on sorghum looking at different varieties. And at this stage, doesn't appear to be the varietal differences in there, but they've all lowered the number compared to the starting point. So we have got some decent options. Cotton, sorghum, sunflower, maize generally, linseed certainly, you know, the brassicas are good. So we've got a range of crops which do assist in terms of trying to manage this issue.
As you said, canola was meant to be one too, but
well, I suppose it's all relative. For people who've been existing in a wheat, chickpea, faba bean, barley rotation, you've got really 4 sucker type crops in general. What we need to do is be able to bring in some crops or varieties of them, which is starting to put a bit more of a lid on those populations.
In the sowing sorghum, how far do the little guys move? If you've got double skip sorghum, would you have a higher population in the skip than you would in the rows?
John and his team might be able to add more. With what we've seen so far, even when we've got wheats 5 rows 30 centimetres apart, we can get 150,000 in this plot with Strzelecki and 10,000 right next door. We saw that in 2011 as well. What I've seen wouldn't suggest there's a lot of lateral movement of them. We actually tested some double skip areas in that sorghum work, and basically there was no difference in population. We were finding, if anything, slightly higher residual population, so it looked like the sorghum was actually helping to bring those numbers down.